Okay, right. Here's Winnie Pool. Okay, we're recording. So, can you look in the camera? And you've got to speak nice and loudly. Okay, so I'm here with Caroline Carr, very good friend of mine. And Caroline is from, and we're all getting wet from Winnie. Caroline was brought up in, New York, weren't you?
Yes, New York.
But I do know that the natural world affected your childhood as you were growing up in a big way, and you now live in England, in rural countryside, and so I was just wondering whether you could sort of maybe share some stories of your childhood, a memorable story, and maybe sort of say how it's affected you with your children, bringing them up.
Well, I grew up in New York City, but I had a double life. So in the summer we would go to the Outer Rondex for 3 months and go completely wild there. But in the winter we were in Greenwich Village in Manhattan. And so both of these worlds were in conflict in a way, because when I'd come back to the city I was desperate to be in the wilderness. So what I always admired about my mother was how she was able to bring that wilderness into New York City, which is quite a feat.
Yeah, and how did she do that?
And she would do things like, in the winter, if there was any snow at all, she'd keep me out of school and take me to Central Park and we'd go sledding.
Yeah.
And I felt like it was a wilderness, because I was little, and she would make it seem like an adventure going there. It was incredible. And then when spring would come, I remember she would do things like, there was a few vacant lots that had sunflowers growing on them, and we'd break into these vacant lots and steal sunflowers. And she would take us up to the Cloisters, which is a park at the top of Manhattan, and we'd go searching through the grass for chives, and we'd pick chives and bring them home.
Put them in pots?
And put them in, no, we put them in eggs, we just cut them.
Forage.
And to me this was like, the most exciting adventure, being a child and doing something like that. It made you feel like you were finding your own food in the wilderness.
Sorry, I'm going to just throw the ball for the dog.
So she was very good at that. And then in the summer we'd go into the Adirondacks, where we really did run wild, and complete contrast, but somehow I had that feeling even in New York. She brought a bit of that into our lives. But
and that's something that hasn't left you, I know.
No. So I will always walk down the street looking for an apple I can pick from somebody's tree, or a blackberry, and in Oxford I know where all the apple trees are. If I'm hungry, in the autumn I can find myself an apple.
And do you think that's why you've chosen to live in rural Oxfordshire, and bring your kids up here rather than
I think so, because it always meant so much to me to have a little bit of wilderness, wherever it was. But I think that's also because of our summers, where we would often go hiking off trails. So we'd go off into the woods, with a map and compass. And my parents always let us go off. My brother would be the oldest person. He was 14 or 15. And we'd go sleep out. I was maybe 4 or 5.
Amazing.
On these mountains, and we could get lost. You could get really, really lost there. But
so you were 4 or 5, and he was only 14.
Yeah.
But she trusted him.
Yeah, because he knew what he was doing.
And did you have any sort of near misses?
Oh, we had lots of getting lost. One time, we were sleeping out on top of a mountain, and my brother had gone ahead with our sleeping bags, so he wouldn't have to carry everything. There were a bunch of kids, and he left them on one top of this mountain. And then he came back and took us all there, and he couldn't find where he left the sleeping bags. So it was maybe, starting to get dark, and nobody knew where they were. So he felt a lot of responsibility being the oldest person.
And you had no mobile phones?
Oh, of course not, no. I mean, we had
don't have them now.
No. So we all sat on one rock, and he crashed off into the underbrush, and about an hour and a half later he came back with all the gear.
Stuff.
He found it. But that was exciting. I remember that.
And have you given your children the same freedom as you had? Because that's something that I struggle with a bit. I had a lot of freedom, but now everybody worries more than, my parents didn't even think about it. But now, you're seen possibly as being maybe a bit of a neglectful parent if you just let your kids go. So you do actually think about it, although I have struggled with it but tried to let my children have the same freedom, and I think you have too, really, haven't you?
Yeah, I feel like my children just haven't been that interested. So I always said go, go, and they sort of mooch around the house too
So
much.
we're gonna interview them
So-
at some point and see
So I
what take they have on
I
it.
don't
but-
know. I've got something wrong, definitely. They haven't had the same adventures that we had. That's definitely true. And I don't know why. It's just,
Although they have had a pretty, as far as today stands, a pretty wild childhood, haven't
yeah, they have. I mean, they've had a lot of time in the woods with no internet and things like that. It's great. They love it. But what they haven't done is just gone off on their own, which we did.
Yeah.
But that might have been partly just because of who my brother was, because he was very adventuresome in that way.
Yeah.
And just hasn't happened to be a child like that, I think.
Yeah. You
In
have to
our
have somebody
family.
leading it.
Yeah.
And confident enough to do that. 'cause
Yeah,
that
but it
takes
wasn't-
a lot of confidence.
I don't think it was lack of confidence. I think it was more that I don't know, they just haven't had quite the same level of wanting that adventure.
But I know your children, I've seen them growing up, and I think they do have this connection with the natural world that's important to them. And what will be interesting is now to see what they do with their children.
I think
what
their
they
their
value.
children will go back to being more adventuresome, I
Yeah,
think.
we'll watch this space, shall
Yeah.
we?
But I think they do have they definitely have a connection.
They do.
Definitely, yeah.
And that's something I think is very important because they understand this balance. They can fit very comfortably into New York, because you go back to New York a lot.
Funnily, they don't really like the city. They
They
much
don't.
prefer being in the country.
But how do you feel about the city now? Do you?
I feel definitely like a country mouse,
Yeah.
in the city. Even
do
though
I.
I lived in New York for more than 20 years, but when I go back, I feel intimidated by the pavement, really,
Yeah.
and the cars and
But
the
perhaps
busyness.
you are still finding the wild in the city, which is there if you look for it, as you said. You're out there collecting your chives for your omelette.
A little bit, yeah. It's New York. The busyness I find a bit much now, being old. But
Anyway, I think that's probably good enough for our first
Yeah.
go. We might actually do some more later, but I've lost a dog, so
Oh.
I need to go and find Flo.
oh,